Hello everyone, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Do Jong-yoon, a research fellow of Regional Integration Program at JPI. First of all, I introduce all speakers of today shortly. Professor Kim, keynote speech, Professor Terada, and Professor Tiborgain. Where is he? Professor Tiborgain, Professor Tan, Professor Bison, and finally Professor Che. Thank you for all participants. All colleagues and audience, welcome to the Jeju Forum and this panel, Regionalism After Liberalism. As you know, this panel is designed to deal with the crisis of regionalism and the liberalism since the launching of United States President Donald Trump administration and the decision of Brexit in UK. On this premise, the panel asks two questions. Firstly, it seems that populism, nationalism, and skepticism are threatening liberalism of the world now. Second, this phenomenon, we can say, a sign of limits of liberalism. This phenomenon, we can say, a sign of limit of liberalism, I can say. So secondly, what is the right way of regionalism in Asia under the crisis of the liberalism? Particularly, we will discuss experience and the challenges of European Union and Asian Pacific countries in this context. For more detail, I would like to suggest let's discuss how regionalism will respond to the challenges in the new context. So we have not enough time to waste because we have only 90 minutes until 2:30. So firstly, let's listen to the keynote speech of Professor Kim entitled Entering a New Phase of Regionalism in Asia Amid the Changing International Economic Order. Please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for your introduction. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It is a great pleasure and privilege for me to deliver this speech in the presence of such eminent scholars in the field of international relations. In my brief presentation, I will speak on my perspective about the future of international trade governance and Asian initiative with a view to pursue the economic regionalism. I hope this presentation provides some interesting topics for our discussion. This year, two major rounds of trade renegotiations will draw our attention to how they will affect international economic transactions, namely Brexit and the United States trade policy, both of which reflect a high national priority on economic sovereignty. While the United Kingdom's renegotiations for Brexit are predictable and will have limited influence on current international trade flows, the prospect of the U.S. trade policy under the Trump administration seems not only uncertain, but also likely to bring about considerable impediments to the development of international cooperation. Thus, in contrast to Brexit, the priority accorded to national economic interests under the U.S. trade policy of the new Trump administration seems to lean towards unilateralism, bilateralism. This will introduce a considerable protectionist influence to the development of international economic relations. With this America First policy, the U.S. will be required to renegotiate FTAs already finalized with its trade partners, including member countries of NAFTA and South Korea to reflect its gains from trade, which could trigger trade conflict and even trade war. Aside from these bilateral agreements, the U.S. government asserts the possibility of taking unilateral import restrictive measures focusing on fair trade against the countries that hold a trade surplus. However, the Trump administration's definition of fair trade implies a short-sighted zero-sum game and is risky in that its one-sided dependent perception only represents the U.S. own national economic situation. In conjunction with trade effects, an international economics textbook rightly advises us to adopt domestically relevant and complementary measures to realize long-term dynamic gains resulting from the international division of labor. For example, macro-micro economic policies, including industrial readjustment and an appropriate compensation scheme in favor of damaged sectors. Neglecting such additional policies or failing to implement them over the proper length of time would lead to an inevitable pileup of complaints from the damaged social class. Relying simply upon protectionist measures clearly will not attain the positive long-term economic objectives such as the strengthening of industrial competitiveness or job creation. The WTO is concerned about the repercussion of such excessive unilateral measures, which could provoke a vicious cycle of protectionism retaliation, as we have already experienced in the past. The WTO's dispute settlement mechanism, DSM, used to be viewed as one of the most salient merits among the diverse roles of the WTO, yet, in general, it seems become regulatory inert and ineffective since the end of the Uruguay round. Compared with the other functions of the WTO, for example, cooperation on and coordination of various non-tariff barriers NTB, the DSM possesses effective tools and to suppress unilateral protectionism, thus contributing to a greater international stability of trade flows. Nonetheless, the 2017 U.S. trade policy agenda of the USTR recently announced that Trump's administration no longer recognizes the WTO's DSM. Instead, it will apply the local process, the legal process defined by the relevant domestic trade law in the event of conflict. This decision certainly implies an abandonment of the U.S. leading guardianship of the current international trade governance and may well accelerate a reduction in the role of WTO and turn it into a simple international cooperation forum. Dear colleagues, the defects and the limitations of the WTO's role, including its role in multilateral negotiations, may have prompted a large number of countries to turn their eyes to economic regionalism, mostly in the form of FTAs. While the first regional wave of the international wave of regionalism was launched in Europe in the 1960s, the second one was led by the Asia-Pacific region with the U.S. initiating NAFTA. An FTA displays many advantageous attributes originating from the law of small numbers. To take an example, this practical approach allows, above all, limited number of FTA candidate countries in preparation to include on common agreement by the way of a la carte these items representing each country's interest to pursue market liberalization. This means that even such thorny agenda items as NTB, which the WTO could not easily touch upon, can be tackled through an FTA. WTO could not easily the outstanding privilege permitted by the so-called waiver clause of the GATT enables the countries concerned to avoid cumbersome multilateral negotiations. The question of compatibility between regionalism and multilateralism has become no more a significant issue in the international arena since most of WTO member countries began to be swept away by the wave of FTAs. Even the U.S. under the Obama administration, after deciding to give up the Doha round in December 2015, turned towards an acceleration of the negotiations for the conclusion of the Trans-Pacific Strategic Economic Partnership, TPP. In this way, the FTA has slowly been established as a de facto WTO plus, completing the WTO's role by compensating for its drawbacks. As the second-best theory suggests, FTAs are generally expected to contribute as a stepping stone to multilateral trade liberalization by expanding in number, which the WTO cannot achieve. From the standpoint of world trade governance, together with the WTO, the FTA constitutes a dual system in which each entity makes up for the other's weak points. In other words, the main role of the WTO remains that of introducing normative cooperation standards and of strengthening trade policies coordination on a global basis. In addition to this, the FTA plays the role of an effective promoter of trade liberalization by removing trade barriers. Until quite recently, 3 series of negotiations on mega FTAs were underway: the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, TTIP, the TPP, and the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, RCEP. Yet, with the arrival of Trump, the U.S. has decided not to join the TPP, and at the same time, the future of TTIP agreement remains pessimistic. The U.S. withdrawal from TPP has left an uncertain outlook for successful launch of the TPP, but has indirectly opened the way for East Asian member countries, including Japan and some ASEAN countries, to concentrate their efforts on promoting the RCEP. In fact, advancing the RCEP has become relatively comfortable, especially for those countries who adopted a careful stance between the U.S. and China. Under these circumstances, and mainly through ASEAN's initiative, negotiations on RCEP involving 16 countries started in 2012 and had already passed the expected deadline at the end of 2016. They will resume negotiations without promising any target date. How then can we forecast the perspective for the successful progress of the RCEP negotiations? It is worth noting some conspicuous features of the region. First, the region includes the most populous countries in the world, which account for around 48% and 31% of global population and GDP respectively. As we know, the RCEP scheme includes enormously diverse countries in terms of their stage of economic development, economic size, economic and political systems and institutions. After 16 rounds of negotiation, the participating countries arrived at an agreement in certain areas, though mostly in the sphere of economic and technological cooperation. As far as liberalization agendas on tackling the removal of barriers to trade are concerned, the progress of negotiations was lagging far behind the schedule due to the divergent positions of the countries concerned. The degree of market opening differs considerably between countries, and in general, market distortions in less developed countries appear more apparent due to high tariff rates and various non-tariff policies. Compared with the TPP, the RCEP is considered as a mid-level FTA and less ambitious. However, throughout the course of the advancing negotiations, the participating countries have run into serious hindrances that principally originate from their different perceptions of market protection, development strategy, and government intervention in the market according to the realities of each country. Hence, to overcome such impediments, a more efficient and systematic approach is needed, which can be achieved by intensifying economic policy coordination amongst the participating countries instead of searching for a solution to each country's individual issues. It would be desirable, for example, to adopt high standard trade rules and principles on regulatory cooperation and convergence. Finally, there is no doubt that without pursuing continuous and elaborate efforts based on the application of the appropriate methodology specifically to the peculiar situation of this region, negotiations aimed at concluding the RCEP will come to nothing. The RCEP map reminds me of a microcosmic feature of the UN, which comprises extremely diverse member countries. From this point of view, I suggested that RCEP should borrow some ideas from the spirit of the UN's Sustainable Development Goals, what you call UN SDGs. In particular, market liberalization combined with intensive cooperation on sustainable development in the region could serve as the basic guidelines for future negotiations. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Professor Kim. Professor Kim pointed out several challenges after Brexit and the Trump phenomena. Professor Kim, take note the Trump trade policy is more serious and uncertain than Brexit because Trump seems to emphasize the unilateralism. But Brexit basically will disturb the current international order. for the long-term perspective. And Professor Kim reminded of the other conceptions such as economic sovereignty and fair trade and tension between the domestic trade law and dispute settlement mechanism and the TPP and the RCEP. Anyway, in first round, we listened to all speakers' talking points in the given topic. In this round, we can listen to more diverse scope, including political economy and international politics. Please, all speakers have to present your presentation within 8 minutes. And it's very short. I'm sorry that do it in the order of sitting you are. The first, the Professor Terada and people again and so on. Before finishing 1 minute, I will call the chime bell like this. Yes. So yeah, please, the Professor Terada. Yeah. Oh, maybe you can choose. I think it is better. Yeah. Yes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, for kind introduction. My name is Takashi Terada. I'm Japanese, but currently staying in Singapore on sabbatical, enjoying very hot, humid the climate without doing anything seriously. So, the invitation to this kind of conference always reminds me of my own profession. Yes, academic researcher. Again, so periodically, I try to accept those sort of invitations. But luckily, this is my first visit to Jeju. So thank you very much for your kind invitation. Already, I submitted my own paper, just 1,000 words. I try to focus on the so-called the bilateralism. Again, it seems to me the current, so I'm not Europe specialist, I try to focus more on Asia-Pacific region, revival of the bilateralism or not. Again, if you look at the history of international political economy, if multilateralism was in crisis, for example, got to Uruguay around the late 1980s, regionalism tended to be rising. Look at fortress Europe, with a decision to introduce the currency, single currency, and also the creation of the U.S.-Canada FTA, which became later NAFTA. It's also mooted in 1980s. And Asia-Pacific, APEC, Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Forum, it was established in 1989 Canberra. And these are all actually considered to be a set of the events, particularly to respond to the crisis of multilateralism, global-based, I mean. Now, regionalism probably considered to be falling into a crisis. So what is the next option we can consider to deal with this situation? So again, as we have observed already, some of the other countries, particularly the United States under the new government, had tried to introduce bilateralism, particularly international political economy field. But bilateralism is not something new to us. If you look at the free trade agreement, FTAs, South Korea, your country, was the front runner by signing a number of bilateral FTAs with the United States, European Union, even recently with China. If you look at TPP, Trans-Pacific Partnership, which Professor Kim mentioned, in a sense, it's a collection of bilateral arrangement. Market access. Again, TPP has 31 chapters. But market access is always core of regional integration in any field. So, trade liberalizations, which means freer market access with the reduction or elimination of tariffs, was always politically contested domestically, right? But TPP, the market access negotiations were mainly done bilaterally. Japan made a huge concession to agriculture, just like Korea did in a chorus. But it was done with the United States. And looking at the situation, Australia, for example, asked the same deal, and Japan promised to offer Australia the free market access of rice. Of course, the size of the access was much smaller compared with the US. So it seems to me TPP was a very fast regional integration framework in Asia-Pacific region, except for ASEAN. Well, ASEAN just declared AAC, but I'm not so sure what AAC meant, and particularly after declaration and more than 1 year ago. But South Korea, for example, as I mentioned before, had a number of FTAs it signed. But how about regional or multilateral integrations? Where's South Korea's participation? South Korea didn't join TPP. CJK, China, Japan, Korea FTA, is still under negotiation, just like RCP. Japan too. 2000, saw the Japan's active participation, sometimes following South Korea's initiatives. Japan's participation enthusiastic about TPP was strongly encouraged by Korea's. And also Japan-EU FTA was done, has been negotiating, but also this was also encouraged by South Korea's initiative. So TPP, from Japanese viewpoint, was something which might help Japan overcome the so-called South Korean dilemma. But unfortunately, the United States, which in a sense invited Japan to the TPP negotiation, because Japan tried to have a bilateral FTA with the United States in the year 2010, together with China. But Japan gave up the FTA with China because high-level standard FTA could not be probably achievable. But USA, we are not interested in bilateralism. Maybe because of the domestic turmoil since ratifying the FTA with Colombia or even Korea. So it was a sort of background. So unfortunately, TPP was created as a very first multilateral regional integration framework. However, US decided to withdraw it. So it was, in a sense, pity. Because TPP had a number of implications, including strategic and political ones. Anyway, this is not the session to talk on this issue. Already. Quite quick. That's all right. It's always happening. So I have to conclude. So my point is, multilateralism is a crisis, right? And regionalism is a crisis, but still we have a bilateralism. I know bilateral FTA impact is small, which confuses the users, which means companies. That's why sometimes I was asked by Korean media a few years ago, what do you think about Korea's decision not to participate in TPP? I said it was a bad decision, particularly for the multinational companies like Samsung, LG, or Hyundai. They have already well established, the supply chain networks in the region. They cannot use the regional benefit. So this is the most significant element of TPP, so-called the rule of origins. Bilateral FTA cannot deal with the rule of origin issues. But TPP was the very first one for Japan or any other country except ASEAN to deal with the rule of origin issues. So 45% TPP promised to offer. This was an ideal idea for Japanese companies because auto parts, if electronic parts produced in China, because China is not part of TPP, but could be imported in a Japanese product, assembled in Mexico, exporting to the United States. That's perfect. But the United States, of course, didn't like this kind of idea. So still TPP 11 or minus USA, it's on schedule. Japan decided to work on it. However, because of the significance of US-Japan bilateral relationships, Japan inevitably needs to pursue bilateral FTA with the United States. So it seems to me TPP minus USA would be progressing, while more bilateral FTA centering on United States might be emerging. So this is maybe the sort of the most likely scenario for Asia-Pacific region to see. So of course I have big questions. What South Korea would do under a new president? So this is my interest coming to, this country this time to listen to this kind of, the ideas. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry that you have not enough time to.
That's all right.
2 minutes pass away after the time bell. I'm sorry that. And Professor Tibor again, please present your topic.
So, all right,
So thank you, Mr. Chair, for a fascinating panel. I'm going to step a little bigger and really address the first part of your question about the crisis of liberalism and then link this to regionalism. I will start in the introduction by saying that we are at a very unusual historical time. This is not usual time. We may have reached the peak of prosperity and integration in human history, and yet we are at a time of great crisis. I'm going to unpack different parts in that crisis, different great challenges, and there are several trends happening at the same time that need to be unpacked. And then I'm going to turn to whether regionalism is a solution. And in fact, after saying a couple words on TPP and RCEP, I'll mostly focus on a new type of mega regionalism, that is the Belt and Road Initiative coming out of China. Just to add something that was not covered so far. So first, I want to say a few more things on liberalism. And I want to talk about liberalism, but also liberal order and globalization. Liberalism, the title for our panel here, is an idea, is a concept, is a theory to some extent, but it's actually mostly the embodiment of a global liberal order. So we are forced to talk about that global liberal order. That includes global institutions, a hierarchy centered on US hegemony, and the reality of interdependence. So what we know in political economy is that global markets, which are the foundation of liberalism or globalization, depend on global institutions, on rules of the game, and in turn, those global rules depend on the agreement of systemically important countries, roughly the 8 to 10 largest countries, to sustain and improve all the time the rules of the games. That's why something like the G20 is so critical. At some level, this is the high table where the large countries have to agree on the repair or the sustenance of global rules. Now, in this context, we observe several trends. First, clearly we see a backlash against globalization, against global liberal integration. And what's particularly striking is that the backlash is happening in the two countries that led the creation of globalization. The UK first, which really instigated some of the first liberalization moves in the 70s, and then, of course, the US. So it's ironic that when so much of our liberalism started with Thatcher, with Reagan, and earlier step taken in the 70s, this is where the crisis has hit currently. I might add, if we put this in a larger context, that, in my paper I quote a historian, Margaret Macmillan, that in a way observed similar trends at the peak of an earlier global liberalization or global liberalism in 1914. That is when global economic integration created a lot of prosperity for many countries, but also involved shifting prosperity, of shifting gains and losses for many social groups, and created different political conditions that in turn eroded the support for liberalism in key countries. And that became a foundation for conflict. So that's the irony, is that liberalism, globalization, accelerate prosperity. They also create unequal gains. And so they create losers. And those losers, when they become large enough, organize politically and can switch a major country and take that country out of the support for the global liberal order. And so there's a perpetual process of erosion and repair. And when erosion goes faster than any process to balance that erosion, then we can see collapse, as we saw collapse in 1914 or the 1930s. I also tend to call this the human governance paradox. That is where our science, our advances in science, our advances in technology, in medicine, or in global economics goes faster than our ability to manage this process of change with the correct institutions and governance. Second, we do face an increase in the functional requirements to make that global order work. We also talk of systemic risks. So the order nearly collapsed with the global financial crisis in 2008. We were that close on September 15, 2008 to a complete collapse, like in the 1930s, and it took enormous actions to save the system. We also have enormous risk with climate change, with global diseases. So there's a set of global systemic risks that are being codified by the World Economic Forum, for example. Third, we're living through the biggest shift in the balance of power in recent history, in modern history, as a result of liberalism or globalization. And this is not something that can be swept under the carpet. We moved 20% of global GDP from established countries to emerging powers between 1990 and now. China was less than 2% of global GDP in 1990 and is now 15% of global GDP. That's a 13% increase in a proportion of global wealth, right? And if you add other emerging powers, you see where the switch is. We also know that OECD countries, the advanced democracies, basically have a stable share between 1950 and 2000 of 60 to 65% global economy. In 2011, that share dropped under 50%. So we're living through a massive shift in global economic power. And then fourth, we are living through a crisis of democracy and domestic governance in 17 out of 20 G20 countries. Only 3 countries today are ready to push actively for global rules and global governance to support a global liberal order. Those are Canada, Germany, and China. We can say a bit about Japan as well, but Japan focuses more on regional and bilateral investments. So how to respond to such crisis? Well, one type of answer to it is global governance. That's where G20 comes in. That's where the SDGs, as just mentioned, at the UN level, or the COP21 and the Paris Agreement. Another answer is nationalism and pulling back, trying to reduce globalization. That's what Roderick calls, as part of his trilemma, the return to a Bretton Woods version 1.0. And the third response is regionalism, to add some stability in the system. So I have to speak very fast and say a few more words here. We have seen, of course, some options coming out of ASEAN, RCEP, but I agree with the first speaker to say that this is a limited operation that won't have systemic impact. The TPP was one attempt to bring stability to about 40-45% or 50% of the global economic system, but it has collapsed for now. So one other attempt at mega regionalism that's coming out now is from China with the Belt and Road Initiative. This is the biggest ever tried initiative at global economic integration, policy coordination, and trade expansion with a massive infrastructure development program ever tried, right? So the risks are daunting. There's a lot of problems potentially, but not only is this initiative targeting 60 countries in the whole Eurasian plus Africa zone, it's also expanding to Latin America, and in fact China has offered it to Canada as well. So eventually it's a global operation coming out of the Eurasia sphere. I'll keep for Q&A, but I'll say one word on the EU. The EU still has a major role to play. It does have to fix its problem with the euro design, but the EU is resilient and will be a big part of the solution in Europe coming forward. In conclusion, we are living through a really historic crisis of the global liberal order, including a crisis of orchestration by the creator of the liberal order. The creator is turning against his creation, that is the US. We also are living through a historic power transition which is massively affecting the trust or the relationship of everybody to the liberal order and to liberalism. We are therefore living through a period of a scramble for a new order and for rules where regionalism is not just peaceful regionalism, is actually competitive regionalism. We're living through a period of intense competition for new rules, but the future of the order is uncertain. at this point. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. And next, Professor Tan, please, at 8 minutes.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and very good afternoon to one and all. My thanks to the organizers for inviting me to be a part of this meeting. One quick qualification as I begin. I primarily do regional security. It's always dangerous and risky to get a guy who does security to speak on economic issues. We all know that the East Asian security situation is not doing as well as it could. A lot of challenges. So hence, however bad the economic situation looks at this point in time, it looks better from my perspective, from someone who does security. That being said, let me make 3 interrelated observations rather quickly. First of all, to my mind, I do not see it as a foregone conclusion that the world will inherently move towards protectionism and populism. It seems to me that yes, there are the signs are there, but we're not quite there just yet. In the light of particularly the sort of mitigating circumstances that have sort of impelled the great powers towards cooperation. Here, of course, I mean China-US cooperation, albeit arguably very instrumental in dealing with North Korea, but these are the kinds of things that stand in the way, it seems to me, small obstacles at least in the way of that great change that my other colleagues have referred to. What would really be bad, I think, would be if a trade war, is initiated, and that is always a big danger. Even greater danger with the rejection, essentially, of global norms and institutions that uphold the global economic order as we know it today. So all these things I concur with my colleagues, but of course, on the other hand, there are those developments that we have seen. Mr. Trump changing his tune on a number of very important issues, but of course we have to watch this situation quite carefully to see if it leads towards the detrimental circumstances that we have spoken of. My second point is this. To me, I think the regional history of East Asia, from the Cold War to the present, has been one essentially of emphasis on the preservation and protection of neutrality on the one side during the Cold War days, all the way to the post-Cold War period of so-called open regionalism. That is to say that East Asia has always seen itself as inherently and inexorably connected with the rest of the world rather than exclusively isolated against it. So I think open regionalism, at least rhetorically, has been the aspiration via APEC and via other forms of regionalism. And indeed, I would also hold to the argument that yes, RCEP and TPP, notwithstanding all the problems and limitations of regional trade pacts, etc., that these are also forms of or attempts on the part of Asia to connect itself with the rest of the world. So in that sense, I think there is a broad-based preference in the region for deepening these extensive connections and connectivities with the outside world. And so in that sense, I think it is important to note that therefore East Asian regionalism did not occur apart from the liberal international order, but indeed it occurred within it. So I think in that sense we can look at open regionalism and say, okay, you've got trade facilitation, you've got inclusive regionalism through the inclusion of outside powers, you've got in a sense regionalism as a modality of last resort, really, when you think about it. So I think all these characteristics to me would go to illustrate that perhaps East Asian regionalism is not the kind of thing that would stand against a global economic order. Third and finally, I think this shared commitment of East Asians to open regionalism makes East Asian regionalism therefore something that stands as a very important, or it could stand as a very important counterpoint or a counter-narrative, if you will, an alternative to the protectionist and a populist trend that we see post-Brexit, post-Trump. And I think in that sense, despite the limitations and flaws that my colleagues here have already enunciated with regards to East Asian regionalism, I, for one, would rather argue that despite its flaws, that perhaps what East Asian regionalism could be or could become would be to stand to represent this very important counterpoint and counter-narrative to the more ugly things that we see the world moving towards. If anything, it stands as a voice against that. And here I hearken back to President Xi Jinping's very important championing of globalization at Davos, and also indeed even I think of South Korea's very important experience back when South Korea was hosting the G20 in providing a very important advocacy on behalf of sustainable development, and these are messages that East Asian regionalism as a whole, notwithstanding all its flaws and imperfections, that this indeed is the kind of role that East Asian regionalism could play in the days to come. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. You did it on time.
Yeah, the only one.
Thank you very much. And Professor Wisdom, please, your presentation.
Thank you very much. And can I add my thanks to everybody else's for the invitation to come and talk to you. I'm going to talk about something slightly different. I'm not going to talk about the economic aspects of the regional developments, but to think about the political implications, because that's also part of this kind of possible liberal order. And I want to talk about the crises in Europe and their possible implications for Asia, and what lessons may be drawn by Asian policymakers as a consequence. And one of the big points to make, I think, is I think the European Union will continue on in some form despite these crises. Whether it's going to be quite as effective, authoritative, and taken as seriously by Europeans or other people around the world is another question altogether, it seems to me. And that's important because up until now, the European Union has been seen, particularly by Europeans themselves, as a major role model and benchmark for the quality and standard and importance of regionalism generally. So if the European Union is having serious problems, this has real implications and significance for everybody else in the world. So to make sense of this, I think one of the things to think about is why was the European Union as successful as it was in the first place, and what were the circumstances that allowed it to become such a force in international affairs in the way that it did originally. And the European Union's success was no accident, I don't think, and one of the significant things that underpinned it was the role of American hegemony in the post-war period, that's the post-Second World War period, and America played a very significant and important role in encouraging European integration and the resolution of particular problems in Europe. And nobody could have foreseen the way the European Union would have developed out of that process at that time. But it occurred in a particular set of geopolitical circumstances that facilitated and encouraged that kind of behavior. And I think that's important to recognize that. We also need to recognize, I think, that when the European Union was effective, it did have a capacity to transfer its ideas and norms to other parts of Europe with some degree of success. Perhaps that's been overstated, and there's a real question mark about how much that process will continue in the future, but there have been some real achievements in the past. The significance of all this, I think, in the contemporary period is that I think there are real doubts about whether Donald Trump in particular and the Trump administration generally actually gets all of that, and the importance of the American role historically and the significance of the European Union as an aid to greater foreign policy success on the behalf of the United States as well as Europe as well. So I think there's a question about whether the significance of the European Union as an expression of American geopolitical policy is actually recognized for what it was. So what does Europe's significance mean for Asia? As I mentioned, I think we have to recognize the particular geopolitical circumstances in which it happened. We have to recognize that Asia's institutions have developed in very different kinds of ways, partly as a consequence of the different role that America played in the East Asian region after the Second World War, establishing a bilateral system of hub-and-spoke security relationships that didn't encourage the same kind of regional integration and institutionalization that happened in Europe. So a very, very different impact and influence from the United States in that part of the world. Consequently, it seems to me at least, many of the institutions that evolved in the East Asian region have a very different character and were intentionally designed to behave in different kinds of ways as well. There's no interest in the East Asian region in the kind of sovereignty pooling and deep levels of political integration that exists in Western Europe, and that's a continuing feature of this part of the world. So the question is, what impact will Europe's problems have on the East Asian region as a consequence? And it seems to me that many of the political elites in the East Asian region won't be at all unhappy about the problems that are currently afflicting the European Union, because many people in the East Asian region had absolutely no interest or enthusiasm about replicating or emulating the kinds of processes and institutions that shaped European outcomes. And for many commentators in Asia, there will be a feeling of, to use the famous German word, Schadenfreude about what's happening to Europe, because they would say, there you go, that degree of cooperation and integration is simply not sustainable, it's not feasible, and we should not emulate it as a consequence. So I think that the lessons that are likely to be learned from the European experience by many Asian elites may be not terribly helpful for those people who are interested in trying to encourage similar levels of political cooperation in this part of the world. So, as far as the future of Asian regionalism is concerned, I think it's likely to continue making the sorts of regional institutions that dominate in this part of the world less effective. There will be less capacity to have a significant influence over the members of some of those organizations, and I think it's really striking that Asia has a number of potentially very useful and well-placed institutions like the ASEAN Regional Forum, for example, which ought to be in the right place at the right time to play a really significant role in trying to address a series of regional security crises. But in reality, the way that it's been designed, the way that it operates, means that it's basically a talk shop that has very little impact or ability to be able to influence the behavior of its members. So I think the big lesson from Europe's experience is that without the right geopolitical circumstances, it's difficult to encourage the development of really collaborative, effective, powerful institutions that can actually address and solve, potentially at least, important regional problems. So I think the lesson is likely to be that Asia's institutions will continue to be less effective than they could be, all other things being equal.
Thank you, Professor. It's on time to get. Finally, Professor Choi, let's listen to your presentation.
Okay, thank you. My short presentation will be about the liberal international order under strain or in crisis and the regionalism in East Asia, following the instruction from the organizer. Okay, is the liberal international order defined as an open economic system and multilateral governance in retreat? Is the 1930s coming back again? I think that's the question that we are asking first. Such apprehension is reinforced by the perception that nationalism, protectionism, isolationism, and unilateralism are on the rise in different parts of the world, as epitomized in the Brexit referendum, the election of Donald Trump to the President of the United States, and the worrisome strides by far-right populist parties in Europe. The liberal international order was a political product underpinned by the American hegemony, supported by the Western alliance during the Cold War period, and extended to the rest of the world in the post-Cold War era. Hegemony, I think, involves at least three elements: capacity, willingness, and common social purposes or shared visions. Okay, now, it is a legitimate question to ask whether the liberal international order is coming to an end, now that, first, American hegemony seems to be in decline, while the power of China is on the surge, for example, and second, America itself, under Trump, the hegemon of the day, is turning away from the liberal international order. Then will the trend of globalization and the regionalism be reversed? The globalization means overall increases in the freedom of movement of goods, services, capital, labor, ideas, and culture, assisted by the development of transportation and communication technology. And the regionalism is a part of and a reaction to globalization at the same time. One can say regionalism is a small-scale globalization or stepping stone to globalization or complement to globalization. So I think regionalism can go hand in hand with globalization. Okay, so what is going to happen to globalization and the regionalism? Maybe it is a mere wishful thinking, but my hunch is that the return of 1930s is not very likely, and globalization and the regionalism will stay here, not only in the long run, it could also gain some steam in the short run, if managed carefully and prudently. Okay, first of all, on the structural level, I would like to point out two factors that work in favor of the liberal international order. The biggest difference between now and the 1930s is the level of institutionalization. Unlike in the 1930s, dense networks of cooperation among nations underpinned by myriads of institutional mechanisms are deeply entrenched not only on the global level but also on the regional and bilateral level in various areas like trade, finance, security, technology, environment, migration, and so on. As Robert Cohen pointed out some time ago, while the existence of a hegemon is necessary to create open economic system, once in place, the institutional arrangements and the habits of cooperation it spawns stick there even if the hegemon is not operative. Secondly, while it is true that China is rapidly becoming a challenger to hegemonic America, it is doubtful that China at the moment really aspires to take the status of global hegemony and reverse the trend of globalization. For the moment, China seems more interested in being as a regional hegemon in East Asia, which the US is not yet very keen to acknowledge, of course. Besides, China is also the biggest beneficiary of globalization. After all, there were several occasions in which the talk of the decline of American power was in vogue. The launch of Sputnik by the Soviet Union in 1957, the breakdown of the Bretton Woods system, and the breakout of a Watergate scandal in the 1970s, and the rise of Japan in the 1980s as well. The US bounced back every time and still remains as the preponderant power, although a feeling of fatigue about the role of world police may be settling in. So it seems premature to predict that the US is in an irreparable course of decline. As long as US hegemony persists, the liberal international order will not easily recede. Further, even if the US under the Trump administration recalls from liberal international order, it would not lead other countries to follow suit. Rather, it would give other countries an incentive to preserve the liberal international order more vigorously because that is in their interests. Even Britain made its determination public that it would become a global UK rather than retreat into isolation from Europe and the rest of the world. But the survival of the liberal international order cannot be taken for granted, of course. These days, issues of globalization and the regional integration tend to be highly politicized in domestic politics, as recently shown in Europe, the US, and Korea, and so on. Regional integration is getting more and more difficult because it enters the realm of mass politics, while in the past it was largely an elite affair. The reasons for the intensified politicization seem to be twofold: distribution and emotion. There is a perception that globalization and the regionalism as its little brother are the culprits for the worsening of wealth distribution. Many countries in the world are experiencing prolonged economic recession, or growth without employment, resulting in high high unemployment rate and polarization in income and employment. True or not, the distributional issues should be addressed in earnest. Maybe it is time for regionalism 3.0. Regionalism 1.0 was in the 1950s and 60s, and 2.0 would be in the 1980s and 1990s. Okay, whatever. Regional integration is in nature market friendly, so that the phenomenon of market failure is very likely. The worsening of inequality being one of the thorniest issues. So regionalism 3.0 should take distribution seriously and must be equipped with adequate compensation mechanism. Otherwise, popular dissent is likely. To confine the scope of this discussion to East Asia, the biggest challenge for globalization and regionalism would be the nationalist sentiments in this region. While in Europe, nationalism has been a taboo and almost moribund, in East Asia, it is well and alive and remains as a cherished political ideology due to the colonial past that many countries in this region experienced. In East Asia, the notion of nationalism is almost equivalent to sovereignty and national autonomy, which is not very conducive to regionalism, because regionalism involves transfer of sovereignty. Then the question is, how do we tame nationalism in East Asia? It is a daunting task, given the eagerness of politicians to use them as a convenient tool for raising their political standing. To avoid nationalism being an obstacle to regionalism, first, East Asian countries should concentrate on highly technical issues first, as stipulated in the functionalist logic, which worked pretty well in Europe for some time. Further, it is necessary to build up bipartisan support and make the issue politically less divisive, which is not an easy task to do. In addition, a logic that reconciles the alleged contradiction between nationalism and regionalism is needed, again, as in the case of Europe, where regional integration was in fact an effort to rescue the nation states. Above all, it is important to keep having discourses on regional integration going, no matter how gloomy the prospects for regionalism turns out to be. Just as nation-states are imagined communities in the first place, as Benedict Anderson said, a regional community could come into reality only when it is imagined, debated, and attempted. So my conclusion is that the moral occasion like today's gathering will be helpful. Okay, that's all.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you, speakers. It is very difficult to make an orders of the speakers and to limit of the present time. I ask for your understanding. But we listened to the topics in scope of economic point of view, and political economy and institutionalism. I think the theoretical approach and the experience of European Union and the ASEAN. So anyway, in second round, I would like to one question for speakers, but I prepared two or three questions, but we have no time. So my questions may be the rough or the fundamental issues for the speakers. I ask for your understanding this, and please respond within the 2 minutes your answer. Firstly, my question goes to Professor Bison. Professor told us European experience of regionalism as a unique case. So you a little bit mentioned about the happy conception. So for instance, do you think of the globalism, regionalism, and the liberalism ideas and its practice are going to the right way now? That is to say, liberalism, globalism, and regionalism, did they make European people happy as a result now? What do you think about this? Regionalism is the right way?
Shall I answer now?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, that's an interesting question. I think you need to think about what liberalism is, what regionalism is, and what globalization is, and there's a long and complex answers to all of those things, which I can't possibly go into here.
Time is up.
But if the question's just about are Europeans happy, again, you can't generalize easily about that kind of thing, but clearly lots of Europeans are not happy. Lots of Europeans have the sense that something's gone wrong, and there are a whole series of possible answers to that question about immigration, about economic problems, about levels of inequality within Europe itself, and crucially, I think, about the possibility of a lack of democratic representation. And this has clearly been an issue that's not easily resolved within the European Union. But my personal feeling is that people have become so accustomed to the benefits of the European Union, they forget what the world was like before the European existed. And if the European Union has done nothing else in its history, it's pacified one of the most violent parts of the planet there has ever been, and there hasn't been a war in Europe for 50 or 60 years. And that's no coincidence, it seems to me. So for those people who criticize the European Union and say it's a waste of time, it's undemocratic, all of those things, there are arguments about those things, but the big payoff is that it's made Europeans think differently about themselves and their relationships with their neighbors, and long may that continue, because if the European Union falls over, we may get a very painful reminder of what the world looks like without powerful, uniting institutions of that sort.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry that I only gonna have a question to you, and the propositive game in your present paper you emphasize the institution, international institution and order. So you suppose that the institution will be the kind of a resilient solution against the rising populism, right way. So in the time of populism, how do we coordinate a critical issue, for instance, growth and development and natural disaster and free trade and the level of domestic politics as well as international politics? What do you think about this?
How can all those things be coordinated? Okay.
Well, perspective of institutionalists. So how could we coordinate the international institution, make coordinate the domestic role for against the populism, for instance?
Right. My short answer is we do have a challenge, right, and a major problem. I'm a bit less optimistic than my neighbors here, including Professor Che, because essentially we're doing a big experiment. So we're going to test Cohen, whether all those institutional ties and all those benefits built over the years are going to stand against the raw anger of crowds, right? It's an experiment, but we can't be sure because in history in the past it has failed. So the challenge is that, I mean, I would first argue again that we can't underestimate how serious the crisis is, because it's one thing to have the UK vote against Brexit. I mean, it does affect deeply the EU, and it takes out the EU as a global player to some extent for years, right? Because it can be so engrossed in those negotiations, and the UK, right? But in a way, it's regional. But it does matter to have Trump, right, elected at the center of the global hegemon when he's he is running an insurgency against the very global order that was created by the US. So we do have a major challenge. The people that elected Donald Trump and that were so strong in so many elections in Europe, and we should not just be too optimistic about what happened in France. I mean, we were within 2 points in the first round of having an extreme right, left or right coming to power. So it was a close call in France. Those forces that are very intense, they cannot be pushed aside. And so there has to be a way to address those forces, those angry forces, right? And they're angry because, well, we know the numbers are bad, right? The majority of Americans are doing worse every year. The majority of Americans in the hegemonic center of the system are worse off every year. something really serious, right? And the same in France. 60% of French are falling behind. So this is a real problem. Whatever the global institutions, if this is not addressed, those forces will uproot the global system, because you're talking of key parts of the global system. And yet, we don't have good ways of solving this, because yes, we should have a regionalism 3.0, or we should have a liberal order 3.0 that is able to address those problems and distribute to those people. But the problem is it's domestic politics, and the US system is not doing the job. In fact, Congress is doing the opposite. And everything that Trump is doing now, in fact, will make his supporters worse off. You know, the budget that he's proposing, the health plan he's proposing, all this is actually going against his own supporters. So they will get even angrier. An angry crowd can destroy the system, right? So the crux really is you have to improve US governance to be able to have a Congress that delivers solutions for its people when it's not right now. And then in Europe, it's an issue of finding a way to indeed spread those benefits to rural areas, to young people, because there is an age discrepancy, there is a region, urban, regional. So we have to find solutions, but the time is ticking. So the problem is really at the domestic level, and critical solutions have to be found. Otherwise, country after country will defect from the global system. So this is serious. In Asia, it doesn't look that serious, but in Europe and in the US is very serious.
Okay, thank you very much. I think which one is the more influence to the populism? For instance, domestic politics or the liberalism in global level. Which one is the more important to the populism in United States? The domestic politics matters or the liberalism in the global level? Oh, yes.
People believe that it's the global level, but in practice it's the domestic level. That is what really meant that the gains of trade were not spread, or that the majority of Americans falling behind in standards of living is actually domestic public policy. So it's a failure of domestic public policy, which then they blame on the global trading system, which actually works. Canada, we're next door to US. We have the same global trade arrangements, but we have intense tools for redistribution, a better taxation system, we have a healthcare system, we have a public school system, we have a few institutional tools that mean that we spread better the gains, and as a result, we don't see the upsurge of populism in Canada. But Congress is not answering those problems in the US because of partisanship and because of redistricting and all this. The Tea Party essentially serving only the interest of the rich suburbans. There's a capture by the rich class. So it's not populism, it's pluto-populism that you have in the US now. The rich class has captured governance and is not answering the story. And that's what the whole world is now writing, right? This anger of people left behind in the US.
Okay, thank you. So,
do you think Trump's populism can be sustainable?
Can be sustained?
Sustainable, durable. I mean, there will be some. There will be many problems which can happen because the Trump's populism has many weak points.
Right.
Logically,
right. I mean, the incredible historic irony, right, is that Trump is cheating his own followers, right? He promised to not take Medicare and Medicaid. His plan is taking it away. He promised to support the poor people in the countryside, and he's actually making them worse off. So they will get mad, and so it's a problem for him. But the problem is when people are mad and emotional, they may not yet return to an old Clinton kind of figure. They may seek an even more radical figure. So in some ways it's not sustainable, but we don't know what comes next, because it has started a sequence which is an ugly, angry sequence, and we don't know where the equilibrium point will be.
That's the dilemma.
That's the dilemma, right?
Okay, thank you very much. And let's turn around. So I would like to ask the role of the China in regionalism perspective. So my question is go to the Professor Terada. You told a little bit of China's role, mentioning RCEP. So China and other Asian countries can construct a new value and take the lead in global politics from perspective of the regionalism, Asian regionalism. China will be the good leader in East Asia.
Well, I think in a sense, yes.
Yeah.
I'm rather harsh about China's foreign policy so far, but sometimes I envy China because it can quickly take the global regional initiative. But Japan used to do it, 70s and 80s. Even recent means 15 years ago, even APEC came from Japan. Asian Monetary Fund was muted by Japanese Foreign Finance Ministry. But this kind of initiative is missing. And instead, whatever China mentioned, particularly, it was very skillful for Chinese leaders to formulate the way of appealing to the global audiences. For example, AIIB or One Road, One Belt, where it was announced, it was Indonesia parliament. Initially, I was very surprised. The Indonesian government accepted the Xi Jinping, the Chinese leader, to address in the parliament, given the history of the Indonesia-China, the relationship. At that time, Mr. Obama missed ASEAN-centered institutions. So Mr. Obama was not there. U.S. was missing. But the Chinese leader actually used this kind of the opportunities to address this, the quite grandiose idea. And of course, most of the ASEAN member countries needed sort of the funding for investment, infrastructures. So I think that China was, because of its, the status, the world largest developing countries, could comprehend very well the problems and the needs of the most of the countries in Asia. And this sort of related to the Trump and the domestic, the problems. So I think that China tried to focus on forgotten countries. And what they actually really need is a trade liberalization, which, US, Japan, other countries try to push, but it's not. So I think the China's approach is just experience, taking advantage of the experience as a developing or emerging economies, but fit into the current situation in which the emerging economies gain more voices in the global stages. And again, these also support China's initiatives. So it's sort of the China try to gain its supporters to realize its own visions. So it's very skillful approaches. This is what I think the China's sort of the successful approach to take initiatives in a global regional sense. So I think yes, in a sense, yes.
Okay.
Sorry, can I ask a question?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. I would like to ask your opinion on this Chinese trade policy. As you were talking about the Chinese external trade policy. China has not been yet recognized as a market economy,
yes, right,
by the EU and the US, and this should not make any hindrance or impediments for China to continue its efforts for liberalizing international trade barrier, trade liberalization, because in principle the FTAs or the liberalizing trade, it is supposed on the market economy to open to open door policy. But in China, there are sometimes too much government intervention in the market. So how do you think about it? Because last year, this year in January in Davos, President Xi Jinping claimed supported. He told that he support the free trade, world free trade efforts, and he will be the lead of that international efforts. You think it is feasible, or it will meet some any barriers, any limits? Please.
Thank you very much. Well, I absolutely share your view that RCEP may not be a replacement of the so-called or TPP or even, the WTOs. Of course, the all nations need to agree. But I think when it comes to, say, sort of the high standard or WTO plus issues, with Japan try to push, for example, well, absolutely China would be, the opposing to it. So I'm not talking about China's initiative in trade in my presentation, even in my answer previously. So what I call trade regionalism is something which China probably is not taking initiative. So I was simply talking about, the developmental regionalism and, in a sense, strategically. And one, clear answer to your question was why China couldn't join TPP once it considered joining it. I think that's why I think Mr. Obama and Mr. Abe both actually strategically pushed TPP very strongly. So I think that without China's participation was strategic benefit for both nations to create something sphere of influence in the region. So I think China, that's why tried to take a strong initiative in something which Japan, U.S. cannot join. This is AIIP.
Okay, thank you very much. So, please, when you speak your topics, so please turn on your mic. But it is a problem for the translator. So, and thank you very much. And the rest on the issue for strategy and security. So, Professor Tan, you talk about the open regionalism. I think it was very impressive to me. So, and we already listened to the European experience from Professor Bison. So, if current protectionism is maintaining for a long time against democratic values, so what do you think of Asian countries' strategy to overcome it?
Sorry, let me get it straight. So it's the question refers to ASEAN countries' ability to
strategy, yes, to overcome it, the protectionism and the populism and the other things.
It's going to be indeed a very big challenge. Clearly, despite my rather enthusiastic apology on behalf of what East Asia can do, what East Asian regionalism can achieve, it is within the Southeast Asian context clearly issues of tremendous importance. Maybe less so in terms of populism, although that is clearly present as well. But I think in the context of countries that are given to efforts to try their level best to preserve their economies from what they see as the implications, the more negative ramifications of what a robust brand of regional integration could imposed on their national economies. I think clearly we do see potentially protectionist trends. One of the biggest of which would involve even the very leader of ASEAN itself, Indonesia, particularly under the current president's economic agenda. So I think as we have heard from my colleagues here on this panel, the ASEAN economic community, is something that waits to be achieved still, precisely for the very kinds of problems that are associated with the inherent protectionism that is still very much prevalent within Southeast Asia. I think what needs to be done is, as I've sought to address in my comments earlier, the messaging needs to be out there, and here I think the role that countries like Singapore in particular can play would be to advocate very robustly on behalf of liberalism but at the same time I think the other comments that my fellow panelists have made, which I fully concur with, is that the system has to address the problems, right? It has to address the question of distributive justice. It has to address the question of a more equitable distribution of wealth. I think that's critical to the success of globalization, and that is something that the system just hasn't quite successfully done. We see the ravages of the system created by that led to the global financial crisis, the excesses of the banks and of the brokerages and all that, and these kinds of things. I mean, regulatory systems have already been in place and are in place, but we need greater governance. We need a more sustained focus, attention by national leaders, and indeed in cooperation with the corporate sector, in cooperation with civil society, to ensure that regulation is carried out, and hence hopefully leading to a more equitable distribution of wealth. And these things are critical, even in the context of Southeast Asia.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Tam. So, Professor Chair, we listened to the experience of Asian countries and Singapore and Indonesia on the strategy against the populism and the other things. So, Professor Chair, in the Korean Peninsula is a very unique situation between Korean people, between the U.S., China, Japan, and Russia, and North Korea is provoking the nuclear issues, as you know. What do you think of Korean own strategy for regionalism compared with the European experience and the other Asian countries?
Is it a strategy for Korea?
Strategy for regionalism, Asian regionalism in case of the Korea, compared with the European experience and Asian countries.
European experience, what?
How does it compare?
How does it compare?
European experience.
The Korea strategy?
Yes, for regionalism in Northeast Asia.
Okay. Well, I guess it's a tough question. I don't think we can replicate the European experience in East Asia because the situation is so different. But one thing that Korea and East Asian countries have in common with the European countries right now is the problems of politicization of this globalism and regionalism because of the distributive issues and, as I said, the emotional dimension, identity politics. Okay, so because Korea is not a great power in this neighborhood, there are some other, big powers like Japan, China, Russia, and the United States. So there are not many space. There are not big space for Korea can move around in promoting or leading the initiative for regionalism. So I think the first thing that the Korea has to do is to make its home front in shipshape. So in Korea, we saw many times that whenever the FTA is on the agenda, on national agenda, there are huge controversies and huge rivalries between different interest groups and different, ideological camps. So we have to find the way to overcome the over-politicization of the issue, first of all. And then I think, as I alluded in my presentation, at the end of my presentation, I think Korea should try to keep the the momentum of talking about regionalism alive, because in the short run, I think it's very optimistic. I'm not very optimistic about the possibility of regionalism as compared to European model, because it's the level of institutionalization in Europe is simply impossible for other regions of the world to follow. But in terms of regionalization, without much institutionalization, I think it is already there in East Asia. For example, the economic exchange between East Asian countries, like a trade and investment and exchange of people, we already reached a very high level, and we try not to undermine the level that we already achieved.
Thank you very much, Professor Che. This time we must stop the panel, but if you understand it, I would like to use the more 10 minutes in first time. You understand? Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I very limited time to us. So, and then we talk about each other. So when it comes to the official dinner today evening, so this time now we will open the question to the floor. If you have any question, please firstly you identify yourself and ask the question. One person, please. No. No. Okay. Oh, please.
I think we can probably hear you, actually.
Thank you. I'm Kim Byung-sub, the invited researcher in Jeju Research Institute. My question is about the regionalism in Asia. I want to divide the supply side and the demand side. As you know, we have a strong discrepancy between the supply and the demand in regionalism. First, the demand side, we have a strong demand for regionalism. For example, the continuous provocation of North Korea and the missile and the nuclear program, and the dispute in the South China Sea and the East China Sea, and the protectionism in worldwide. But supply side, we have I'm afraid we are losing the momentum. Our role model in Europe, the regionalism is collapsing. I know I don't want to say the collapsing. It's just the idea of European Union is decreasing anyway. And in Asia, the strong rivalry between China and Japan, and the weak leadership of ASEAN, they are still sitting in driver's seat, but their leadership is not very strong. So my opinion is that there are strong, very heavy discrepancy between demand and the supply of regionalism. In this situation, what is your opinion about the future of regionalism?
Okay, Professor Bison.
I'm not sure I agree, actually, because I think one of the paradoxes in this part of the world is that there's actually an oversupply of potential institutions, but the reality is that none of them are very good. And I think part of the problem is there's competition between all of these different initiatives, because just about every leader in the region has an initiative of some sort about what the region should look like, and the problem is that they compete with authority or relevance with each other. So none of them are very good. So in my humble opinion, what might be a good idea is to get rid of some of these institutions, for example, like APEC, which I still can't quite understand what the point of APEC is, but they could get rid of a few institutions and narrow them down and maybe have one big organization that looks after economic issues and one institution that looks after security issues, and the implication would be that the countries that are involved in those institutions actually take them seriously and agree to come up with binding agreements that they will act upon. So I don't think it's a question of not being enough supply of institutions. It's institutions of the right sort that people actually take seriously and give the authority to actually make decisions collectively to solve collective action problems in the region, in my view anyway.
Professor Bergin? Yes.
I have a couple controversial and clear points to make on this. The first one, so I should disclose that although I come from Canada, I'm originally from France. I got quite involved in the EU process early part of my life. And the lessons from the EU are not as simple as what we often portray. First, it has been an enormous success until 1992, right? So essentially, the early part, which is the trade integration, the peacemaking process, the integration on environmental policy, on all kind of stuff, has been very successful and was strongly supported, right, by the majority of Britain always being a case on the side, never having that full support, but in most other countries you had 65% support all along. Then the euro is one bridge too far. I mean, because it's hard to do, you need an optimal currency area. And the leaders did not anticipate that first global markets would go this far and offer that much money to countries like Greece when there was no project worthy of it, and then they have a huge problem afterwards. So they made mistakes letting Greece and Italy in, and then they designed it wrongly. Now they have to deal with the legacy of that, and that is eroding the support for the EU. But I think they will muddle through and find a solution because there is no plan B. The French, talk to Macron's team or talk to the Germans, they know very well that any breakdown of EU will be a disaster. Disaster in the short term and disaster in the long term. There'll be no more European voice in the world. So they'll find a way out. And so we should not have the simplistic conclusions that the EU is not working out. It's worked very well, but watch out when you do a common currency. That's the first lesson. And second, they will actually hang together. And even the voters in France or Italy, etc., know that, right? That's why they voted just the way they voted. Even the Greek voters. My second point on Asia, I actually agree with Professor Beeson. Essentially, it's a China-Japan issue at the core. You would not have had any movement in the EU without Germany and France working closely together. And it's hard to do intense integration that's functionally solving problems when, think of it, in 2000, Japan was actually twice the size of China, economically speaking. And in 19, it was 4 times 1990. But 2000 is not long ago, twice. Today, China is 3 times bigger than Japan. You have a ratio of 1 to 6 in 15, 16 years. When you go through something like this, that fast, right? It's historic. You never have to change that fast anywhere in world history. It repositions all the time the position of countries. And so it makes taking leadership in regional integration very difficult because China keeps waiting and Japan has its own preferences but is forced to address them to the new reality. Korea is in the middle. Korea, the 2 biggest sources of ideas are Korea and Singapore in many ways, but they have to maneuver a very complex environment with Japan and China, and Indonesia being a complex player. So that's the issue. But I would agree that eventually I've written an article on East Asian paradox, for example. There's so much common interest, even between Japan, Korea, and China, just for Northeast Asia. If they get to cooperate on things like environment or on global economic policy or managing US debt, because they hold half the US debt together, that at some point that rationality will take hold. And it's like an arbitrage gap. At some point someone will realize that they can benefit by working together. But there is delay because of transition of power.
Okay, thank you very much. Other speakers to the response to the question? Okay, thank you. Professor Taylor? Shortly, please.
Yeah, well, actually the East Asia is very different from Europe. One point, we haven't reconciliated to each other yet. Still we have disputes on islands. We have historical issues. But, the Northeast Asia is a very interesting experiment. With those basic political history issues existing, whether those countries can integrate or not. So I think if Northeast Asia can do it, this will be the very first time in the history of the world. So we are still in the process of creating a new model. So I don't know how long it can run, but we are very much different from Europe, I have to say.
We need it somewhere.
Okay. Thank you very much. In this panel, I would like to conclude the 4 points finally. Firstly, nationalism, populism, and my country first slogan, such as, will hit the limit because of their own contradiction. So, domestic politics such as principle based on the democracy, human rights, and liberty will be the fundamental driving force for the future regionalism. Secondly, European regionalism and the Western experience are the unique tradition that is achieved by its political and social circumstance. So Asian countries and Korea have to find out their own way in the given the unique reality, I think. Thirdly, regionalism in the future will introduce diverse spaces in the conditions of coexisting, free trade and sustainable development, regionalism and globalism, and developing country and developed countries. I was impressed in the particular the coexistence of development and liberalization Professor Kim already mentioned. And finally, China has a possibility to lead the ASEAN regional order through the RCEP now, but they have to also still limit the challenges because China must present its values and the power as a good leader. So I think it is useful to talk today. Thank you for all speakers and audience today once again. And this is a notice of all speakers are invited to official dinner in Tamnaon, 5th floor, today evening, 6 o'clock. And in the round table, we will talk about more things, about the topics. If you come there, you can find out the notice board, the JPI in the table. Thank you very much today. Thank you.